For more than 2 decades, Judge Evelyn Harper held an iron grip over the courts of Montgomery County, Alabama. Her courtroom, tucked away in the heart of the courthouse in the bustling city of Montgomery, was a place where fairness seemed like a distant memory, and the scales of justice appeared to always tip in the direction of those with the most power. Judge Harper wasn't just any judge, she was known for her unwavering control, her sharp tongue, and a tendency to rule with a bias so thinly veiled that it became infamous among local attorneys. In particular, African American defendants and attorneys often felt the weight of her disdain. It wasn't just that she had a reputation for ruling harshly against them, it was that she made sure they knew who was in charge. Judge Harper's reputation was built on years of consistently biased rulings, and she was careful to make sure that everyone knew her decisions were not to be questioned. Her interactions with lawyers were dismissive, her tone always cutting and condescending. She rarely, if ever, looked over the top of her reading glasses, speaking in a measured tone that left no room for disagreement. Yet, there was no mistaking the harshness in her voice, a voice that crushed anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Over time, rumors swirled about her courtroom. Attorneys would exchange whispered stories in the hallways, in private meetings, or at local bar events about the way she treated them, particularly black attorneys, and how cases seemed to always go the same way. It wasn't that Judge Harper was ever overtly malicious, it was something subtler, something that played out in the way she ruled on objections, how she ignored certain evidence, and the way she manipulated the trial process itself. It was an unspoken understanding: if your case made its way to Judge Harper's courtroom, your chances of success were slim, especially if you were a person of color. For years, many had tried to challenge her, but it was a daunting task to take on a judge with such deep roots in the legal system, someone who had been in the game so long that the system itself seemed to protect her. But things were about to change. The day that defense attorney Marcus Johnson entered Judge Harper's courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Known for his impeccable skill in the courtroom and his relentless pursuit of justice, Marcus was a man who had built his career by taking on the toughest cases. He wasn't intimidated by Harper's reputation, and he wasn't afraid of standing up to her. Marcus had seen too many injustices to let this one slide by, particularly as he represented his client, Jonathan Roberts, a man wrongfully accused of assault. Marcus wasn't just there to defend Jonathan. He was there to challenge the very system that had allowed someone like Judge Harper to remain in power for so long. As Marcus entered the courtroom, the weight of years of injustice seemed to hang in the air. Judge Harper barely glanced at him, her expression betraying nothing but contempt. "We don't have all day, Mr. Johnson," she said without even looking up from her paperwork. Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade, making it clear that she didn't believe for a moment that Marcus was going to win this case. But Marcus wasn't there to win the case in the traditional sense, he was there to do something far more important, to hold a powerful judge accountable for her actions. When Marcus Johnson entered the courtroom that day, he knew it wasn't going to be an ordinary case. He had faced tough trials before, but this time, there was more at stake than just the defense of his client, Jonathan Roberts. Marcus understood the kind of judge he was up against. Judge Evelyn Harper was notorious for her manipulation of the court system, and she had become the embodiment of everything wrong with the system. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. He had spent years building a reputation for being relentless in his pursuit of justice, especially for those who had been wronged by an unfair system. This wasn't just about winning for Jonathan, it was about righting a long-standing wrong. As Marcus walked toward the defense table, he could feel the weight of the moment. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy, as if everyone knew something big was about to happen. Judge Harper didn't even look up from her paperwork as he approached. Instead, she spoke without any warmth or acknowledgement. "Mr. Johnson, I trust you've prepared for today. Let's not waste any time," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. Marcus remained calm, his demeanor unreadable. He knew better than to show any signs of frustration, though inside, he was burning with the need to expose what was happening. He glanced over at Jonathan, who sat beside him, shoulders hunched and eyes cast downward, clearly a man who had been through too many trials and tribulations at the hands of a system that had already decided his fate before he even set foot in court. Marcus took a deep breath and steadied himself. This wasn't just about defending Jonathan's innocence. It was about exposing the injustice that had been allowed to thrive for far too long in Judge Harper's courtroom. The trial began, but it quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Every objection Marcus raised was met with a swift dismissal from Judge Harper. When he pointed out flaws in the prosecution's case, she waved them away as if they were nothing more than an inconvenience. The way she handled the trial, almost like a performance, was painfully obvious. The jury, though perhaps initially unsure of what they were witnessing, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as they recognized the clear bias that was playing out in front of them. But despite the growing discomfort, no one had the courage to speak out. That is, until Marcus did. With each passing moment, Marcus grew more aware of the full extent of Harper's corruption. It wasn't just about bias, it was a pattern, a system of ruling that had been in place for decades, and it was all starting to unravel in front of him. He had prepared for this moment for years. He had watched, learned, and waited for the perfect opportunity to expose her. This trial, though it seemed to be about Jonathan's innocence, was actually the stage for a much larger battle. Marcus knew that if he played his cards right, he could bring down a judge who had been untouchable for far too long. As the trial went on, Marcus began to chip away at Harper's control. He remained calm and calculated, making sure every move he made was precise. Every objection that was dismissed, every argument that was ignored, only built up the case he was planning to make. And when the time came, Marcus knew it wouldn't just be Jonathan's freedom at stake. The very integrity of the courtroom was on the line, and Marcus was ready to fight for it, no matter what it took. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom only grew. Marcus could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him, but he remained calm and focused. The more he observed Judge Harper's behavior, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just her bias that was apparent, it was the way she ruled with an air of certainty, as though she held the final say in every case before her. But Marcus was determined to turn the tide. Every time Marcus raised an objection, Judge Harper dismissed it without a second thought. Her smug, almost bored expression made it clear that she saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Thomas King, seemed to thrive under her favoritism, and the jury sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure of how to process what was happening. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the case was rigged from the start. Judge Harper had already made up her mind, Jonathan Roberts was guilty, and that was that. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. He had come prepared, knowing that Judge Harper's arrogance would eventually lead her to make a mistake. And when the moment came, Marcus was ready. It started with a small but crucial detail. The prosecution had just introduced a piece of evidence that had not been disclosed during the discovery phase of the trial. Marcus's eyes flicked to the documents in front of him, and he knew immediately that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. The law was clear. Any evidence not disclosed to the defense before trial was grounds for a mistrial. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, the prosecution has just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in discovery. That's a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial. Judge Harper didn't even look up from her papers. Denied, she muttered, almost absent-mindedly, as if the request were beneath her. Marcus's heart raced, but he didn't let his frustration show. He knew what needed to be done. He raised his voice slightly, ensuring that every person in the courtroom could hear him. To be clear, Your Honor, he said, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation. Harper didn't flinch. I said denied, Mr. Johnson, she snapped, her voice colder now. The courtroom felt electric with tension. The jury shifted in their seats, and Marcus could sense the growing unease in the room. It was becoming obvious to everyone what was happening. Judge Harper wasn't following the law, and she didn't care who knew it. But Marcus wasn't backing down. "I move for a mistrial," he repeated, his voice even. "The prosecution has violated the rules, and you are refusing to uphold the law." At that moment, Marcus knew something had shifted in the room. The tension had gone from subtle to palpable. The jury, who had been silent up until now, couldn't ignore what was happening. And neither could the rest of the courtroom. Marcus had just exposed Judge Harper's refusal to play by the rules, and he wasn't about to let her sweep it under the rug. But just as he was about to speak again, the doors to the courtroom slammed open, and 2 federal agents walked in. Their arrival was swift and deliberate, and the entire room fell into stunned silence. No one expected what happened next. The agents approached the bench, and without ceremony, they handed Judge Harper a warrant for her arrest. For the first time in her long career, Judge Harper lost control of her courtroom. The courtroom, once tense and thick with the weight of injustice, now hung in a complete and stunned silence. The arrival of the federal agents had thrown everything into chaos. For the first time in her career, Judge Evelyn Harper was no longer the one in control. As the agents moved toward the bench, everyone in the room could feel the shift. The power that had once seemed so absolute was slipping through Harper's fingers. It was a moment that had been years in the making, and Marcus Johnson stood at the center of it, watching as the pieces of his strategy fell into place. The lead agent, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, flashed a badge toward the courtroom, signaling the seriousness of the moment. He addressed Judge Harper in a calm, measured tone that only served to highlight the gravity of the situation. "Judge Harper," the agent said, his voice echoing in the still room, "we need to speak with you immediately." For a brief moment, Judge Harper's face betrayed confusion, her sharp eyes narrowing in irritation. "I'm in the middle of a trial," she snapped, trying to assert control. She was the one who had ruled this courtroom with an iron fist for so long. But the agent remained unfazed, his expression impassive. "This is urgent, Your Honor," he replied, his voice unwavering. The other agent stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "This is a matter of federal interest," he stated, his voice carrying authority. "It cannot wait." The tension in the room was palpable as the gallery began to whisper in hushed tones. The reporters, who had been scribbling in their notepads throughout the trial, suddenly paused and exchanged glances, their pens frozen in midair. Even the jury, who had been trained to remain impartial, couldn't hide their curiosity as they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that no one had expected this turn of events. Judge Harper, her usual confidence faltering, stood up straighter in an attempt to regain control. "We are not taking a recess," she declared, her voice edged with frustration. "The defense has wasted enough of this court's time." But the agents were not intimidated by her words. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the lead agent announced, his voice cutting through her defiance like a blade. The words hung in the air for a long moment, the significance of the statement sinking into every corner of the room. The shock was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Harper had lost her iron grip on the proceedings, and it was happening right before everyone's eyes. Marcus Johnson stood silently, watching as the federal agents moved in. He knew this was the moment he had been preparing for. His patience had paid off. The very woman who had made so many people's lives miserable was now facing the consequences of her actions. And it was all happening in front of the jury, in front of the gallery, and most importantly, in front of Jonathan Roberts, his client, who had been wronged by this corrupt system for far too long. As the agents read out the charges against Judge Harper, bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, Marcus felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. But he didn't let it show. His face remained calm and composed. He had fought for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he knew the battle was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning, and this was only one victory in a much larger war against the corruption that had festered for years. The courtroom was alive with shock, but Marcus remained focused on the task at hand. With Judge Harper now in the hands of federal agents, the case had taken on a new meaning. The truth had finally been exposed, and there was no going back. The moment Judge Evelyn Harper was arrested, the courtroom was plunged into a stunned silence. No one, not even the seasoned attorneys, had anticipated this shocking turn of events. For 24 years, Judge Harper had controlled this space with an iron fist, intimidating everyone who dared to question her authority. Now, she was the one being led away, her hands cuffed behind her back, the very system she had manipulated finally catching up to her. The federal agents, unshaken by her defiant glare, escorted her out of the courtroom, and the reality of the moment began to settle over everyone present. Marcus Johnson stood tall at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the door through which the agents had exited. He had known this day would come, he had prepared for it. But seeing it unfold in real time, with his client, Jonathan Roberts, standing beside him, was a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. This wasn't just about Jonathan's case, it was about every person Judge Harper had wronged in the past. It was about the countless victims who had been silenced by her power and the broken system she had cultivated for so long. For a long moment, the room was still. Then, a murmur swept through the gallery, and the jury exchanged uncertain glances. The courtroom, once dominated by Judge Harper's oppressive presence, was now filled with an energy that had been missing for years. The injustice that had been rampant for so long was finally being exposed for what it was. Marcus could feel the shift. This was no longer just a legal battle, it was a moment of reckoning for the entire system. The new judge, an older, graying man with a reputation for fairness, took his seat at the bench. He was immediately handed the reins of a courtroom that had been controlled by corruption, but his presence brought an air of calm and authority. As he surveyed the room, his gaze landed on Marcus, who stood with his arms folded, a quiet sense of triumph behind his composed exterior. The new judge didn't waste time. Given the developments, he said, his voice steady and clear, I move to dismiss the charges against Mr. Roberts. A wave of relief washed over Marcus. He had anticipated this, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real. Jonathan Roberts, the man who had been falsely accused of assault and dragged through an unfair trial, was now free. The weight that had been bearing down on him for so long lifted in an instant. Jonathan, who had been so tense throughout the entire trial, exhaled slowly as the handcuffs that had bound him to the system were finally removed. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the freedom he had been denied. Thank you, Jonathan whispered, his voice filled with emotion. His gratitude was apparent, but Marcus simply nodded, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. The courtroom officer who had once served under Judge Harper, someone who had witnessed the corruption firsthand, stepped forward to remove Jonathan's shackles. As he did so, there was a moment of quiet acknowledgement between him and Marcus. It was a silent recognition that the tides had changed, that the system was finally being held accountable for its wrongs. Marcus watched as Jonathan stood, his body still tense but his posture finally breaking free of the burdens he had carried for so long. As Jonathan walked toward the exit, Marcus followed closely behind. The courtroom, though still buzzing with the echoes of what had just happened, felt different. The victory wasn't just about the legal win, it was about a larger, more powerful shift. Justice, in its truest form, had prevailed. But Marcus knew this victory was only a small part of a much larger fight. As he looked at Jonathan, a man who had endured so much, he understood that this was just the beginning. There were more corrupt judges, more broken systems, and more innocent people who needed to be fought for. And Marcus was ready. The battle for justice was far from over, but today, the good guys had won. As the final echoes of Jonathan Roberts' freedom settled in the courtroom, a sense of calm began to wash over Marcus Johnson. The battle had been hard fought, but the victory was sweet. The corruption that had tainted Judge Harper's courtroom for over 2 decades had been exposed for all to see. The agents who had arrested her had walked out with their heads held high, but it was Marcus who stood tall, his quiet resolve radiating with the weight of what he had accomplished. Justice, at last, had been served. The room, once heavy with tension, now buzzed with a sense of uneasy relief. The jury, no longer bound by the pressure of their previous circumstances, exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with the ruling. The reporters scribbled down every detail, eager to capture the historic moment. For the first time in years, a corrupt judge had been held accountable, and it was all unfolding before the eyes of a captivated public. It was a rare, almost poetic, moment in the fight for justice. But for Marcus, the satisfaction was fleeting. This was not the end. The victory was personal for Jonathan, yes, but it was also a statement that, no matter how powerful one might become, no one is beyond accountability. Marcus had taken down a figurehead of corruption, but the larger system that allowed individuals like Judge Harper to flourish still stood. He knew that the work was far from over. Marcus turned to Jonathan, who was still absorbing the surreal reality of his newfound freedom. His eyes, once clouded with despair, now shimmered with hope. The man who had been wrongfully accused, unjustly imprisoned, was now free to go home. But Marcus knew the scars of this ordeal would never fully fade for Jonathan. The years lost in the system, the damage done to his reputation, and the pain of being unjustly labeled were things that would stay with him forever. There would be no easy fix for that, no quick resolution. "Thank you," Jonathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Marcus simply smiled and placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You don't owe me anything. You never did. Just live your life the way you deserve to." But Marcus knew there were more battles to fight. This victory, while monumental, was just a single battle in the war against systemic corruption. It wasn't just about Judge Harper, there were many more like her out there, hidden within the system, using their power for their own gain. The fight for justice wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus's mind raced with what was next. He had already made plans to pursue other cases of corruption, to expose the flawed systems that allowed for injustices like Jonathan's to persist. He would continue fighting, continue uncovering the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. His job wasn't done yet, there were still so many lives that had been ruined by the kind of corruption Judge Harper had personified. But for now, as Jonathan walked out of the courtroom, free at last, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The journey had been long, and the stakes had been high. Yet today, justice had prevailed. And that, in itself, was worth celebrating. As Marcus Johnson walked out of the courtroom alongside Jonathan Roberts, the weight of their victory still hung in the air. But as they made their way through the doors, the full magnitude of what had just unfolded began to sink in. The courtroom was a different place now, it wasn't just the physical space that had changed, but the atmosphere itself. The walls that had once echoed with the sound of injustice now stood as silent witnesses to a historic moment in the fight for accountability. Judge Evelyn Harper's reign of corruption had been brought to an end, but Marcus knew that this victory was just one step in a long journey. The road to real change was still ahead. Jonathan, his face still filled with disbelief, turned to Marcus as they reached the hallway. "What now?" he asked, his voice still thick with emotion. The man who had spent years falsely imprisoned, wrongly accused, now faced the uncertain future of a life interrupted. Marcus paused before answering, thinking carefully about how to frame what had just happened, and what still needed to be done. "We take it one day at a time," Marcus said simply, his voice steady and reassuring. "You've got your life back. Now, it's time to make sure others get the same chance." Jonathan nodded, though he still couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be done. "But what about all the other people like me? The ones who didn't have someone like you to fight for them?" Marcus looked at him, his expression serious but hopeful. "That's why we keep going. This fight isn't over. It's bigger than just this one case. We have to make sure no one else falls through the cracks." Marcus had long understood that the justice system was flawed, but now, seeing Jonathan's gratitude and pain side by side, he knew that real change had to happen from the ground up. The system needed to be rebuilt, brick by brick, with more transparency, accountability, and fairness. He had seen firsthand the destruction that one corrupted individual, like Judge Harper, could cause. But he also knew that Harper wasn't an isolated incident. There were more people out there who had suffered in silence, under the weight of corruption and bias, and Marcus wouldn't rest until they had a voice. The work ahead would be monumental. Marcus had already begun gathering evidence on other cases of judicial misconduct, learning from his experiences and preparing for the next battle. He had built a network of allies, fellow attorneys, journalists, and activists, all committed to bringing about change. But he also knew that real, lasting reform would require more than just legal victories. It would require a shift in the cultural mindset, a collective commitment to truth, justice, and equality. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the bright sunshine felt different. It wasn't just a new day for Jonathan, it was a new day for justice. People who had watched the trial unfold, either in person or through media coverage, were beginning to understand that the fight for accountability was not just about one case. It was about the future. It was about creating a system where every person, regardless of race, background, or status, had a fair shot at justice. Marcus looked at Jonathan one last time before they parted ways. "You did it. You fought, and you won. Now it's time for the rest of us to do the same." As Jonathan walked away, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This case had been a victory, but the fight was far from over. The legacy of justice was just beginning to take shape, and Marcus would be there, leading the charge for as long as it took. The story of Marcus Johnson and Jonathan Roberts teaches us a powerful lesson about the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how daunting the challenge may seem. Marcus's unwavering commitment to justice in the face of corruption reminds us that we all have a role to play in holding systems accountable. It shows that one individual's courage can spark change, even against the most entrenched powers. For many of us, especially those who have lived through periods of injustice or inequality, this story is a reminder that progress takes time but is always worth fighting for. It's never too late to make a difference, whether by speaking out, supporting others, or simply standing firm in our beliefs. The journey may be long, but as Marcus's example shows, the pursuit of fairness and truth is what ultimately shapes a better future for everyone. As we move through life, we should remember that true justice is about more than just laws, it's about doing what is right, even when no one else is looking, and ensuring that others, like Jonathan, have a chance at a fair shot.